on Earth Community Podcast. I'm your host, Aaron Perry, and today we're visiting with Karenna Gore. Hey, Karenna.
Hi, Aaron. Thank you so much for having me on the Why on Earth podcast, which is great.
It's a real pleasure, and I'm thrilled we can talk with you, especially given what's going on in the world right now. And I want to get to that, but first, let me introduce you to our audience. For those who don't know you yet. So Karenna Gore is the founder and director of the Center for Earth Ethics at Union Theological Seminary. The Center for Earth Ethics bridges the worlds of religion, academia, policy, and culture to discern and pursue the changes that are necessary to stop ecological destruction and create a society that values the long-term health of the whole. She is also an ex officio member of the faculty of the Earth Institute at Columbia University. Ms. Gore's previous experience includes serving as director of Union Forum at Union Theological Seminary, legal work at Simpson, Thacher, and Bartlett, in the Legal Center of Sanctuary for Families, and serving as Director of Community Affairs for the Association to Benefit Children and Riverkeeper. She has also worked as a writer and as the author of Lighting the Way, 9 Women Who Changed Modern America. Ms. Gore is a graduate of Harvard College, Columbia Law School, and Union Theological Seminary. She lives in New York City with her 3 children. Now, you live in New York City ordinarily, but presently you're not there because why? What's going on in the world?
Well, in this time, this pandemic of COVID-19, coronavirus, when the schools shut down and people were asked to work remotely, I'm one of those and well aware of the privileged nature of this, who was able to go out of the city to a place in the Catskills that I have shared with my former husband, and I have my kids up here. They're doing school from up here, and I'm doing work from up here. So I'm in the Catskills, in the Western Catskills, and I apologize if the Wi-Fi drops off, by the way, because it is a bit spotty. But that's where I am, and I really appreciate being able to spend this time with you and your viewers when we can really reflect on so much that's going on right now in the world.
Yeah, absolutely, Karenna. And I just want to give a little teaser to the audience that we're going to be sharing some special projects and links a little later in the discussion that are going live right now in the context of Corona and COVID and everything that's happening. So want to make sure folks catch that. And it's so interesting to me too that so much of your work centers around relationship with Earth, with planet, with biosphere. And you do that from one of the largest and most densely populated cities in the world, certainly in the United States. And I'm just curious, as a way to kind of get us grounded in our discussion today, what does Earth ethics mean, and what does that mean in the context of education?
Well, thank you for that question. Ethics is defined differently depending on who's doing the ethics, but essentially it is questions of right and wrong, or good and evil, or just or unjust. It's different from law. In some, we want our ethics to match up with our laws. It's wrong to kill someone. It's also illegal. But ethics is also, it's really most important during those times when a deep sense of right and wrong is out of step with the law, and also out of step with social norms, which is another component that we look at. So right now, with the circumstances that we're in ecologically, we have to acknowledge and face the fact that the drivers of ecological destruction are, for the most part, perfectly legal and in line with social norms. So ethics becomes especially important in terms of thinking about the earth, how we relate to nature, to this planet. We are coming up on the 50th anniversary of the first Earth Day. And we're in a situation where we have a looming climate crisis. We have, I was born in the early 1970s, and in my lifetime, the human population has doubled, and the population of wildlife has been cut in half. We've lost about half the world's forests. We know the bleaching of the coral reefs and the depletion of aquifers of groundwater. We face an extinction crisis. There are so many ways in which the way our society is organized right now is putting great strain on the earth. And so earth ethics looks at that. And there are some deep roots to how we got here. And I know you've explored some of this on your other podcasts. So we look at those and think about what is the circle of moral concern that people normally think about. And I have a friend at the Church of Sweden who says that in any room where there are decisions made about energy policy, environmental policy, there should be 3 empty chairs designated for those who are most impacted and least likely to have a voice. And those should be for the poor and marginalized peoples of the world, for future generations, and for all non-human life. And when you think about it, if we had paid attention to those 3, we would not be in this crisis. So earth ethics is a construct to think about how do we change who we're paying attention to, that sense of moral accountability, to include those 3 empty chairs. In terms of education, it is also a very big challenge to try to conceive of how we can become ecological citizens in this world. Many people don't know, for example, what watershed they're in, where the waste goes that you throw out in the garbage or you flush down the toilet, where the power comes from when you turn on the lights. And yet these are all connected to ecological realities and systems and to other communities that if we're more aware of, then we'll be able to change for the better.
It's so interesting to recognize and talk about and express that in many respects, what we might be compelled to do, what we might find to be a moral imperative, doesn't necessarily match with social norms. And it makes me think about the civil rights movement, especially around the middle of the 20th century, and with amazing leaders and a whole bunch of dedicated individuals whose names we don't know as well as somebody like Reverend Martin Luther King, for example. It was the hard work of a whole lot of folks in a lot of different communities who helped to transform the social norms. And of course, it doesn't happen overnight. It's not like flipping a switch, but I think it's fair to say that we've made some very real progress on that front, and that it might provide a hopeful pattern for us to think about in terms of the ecological challenges that we're facing.
Absolutely. I think that's a very rich connection to draw. And it is indeed a time when we can think about that a deep sense of right and wrong was out of step with laws and with social norms. And so some of the movements, the lunch counter sit-ins, the freedom rides, were about unmasking the unjustness, the unethical nature of those laws. And there were, as you say, people behind the scenes or in the grassroots layer of that movement, like Septima Clark is one example, who ran citizenship schools in the South, and the people that went through and trained to know basic civic rights and also strategies of solidarity, of coordinating, of organizing. Among the people that went through those classes was Rosa Parks. Another one was John Lewis. So there are people who didn't come out of nowhere. They came through a movement and a type of education that was not at all top down, not at all based in kind of an ivory tower academy, but based in generating consciousness and knowledge and experience among people. So if we take that example in this time of ecological crisis, then we might be able to do the same thing. Another thing about drawing that connection to the civil rights movement is to consider the role that religion played. So we're based at a seminary, the Center for Earth Ethics, and it has a very interfaith tradition within it. And we don't forward one religious point of view, but we take religion very seriously for a few reasons. For one thing, we look not only at the role of religion for good, but also the role that it's played for ill. And there are some real theological questions about the illusion of our separation from nature, how we even talk about climate and environment, and sometimes we haven't recognized that it's actually the air and the water and the soil that are part of our bodies. But another thing about engaging religion is to look at what moves and motivates people in their behavior, what can draw from deeper values. And of course, in the civil rights movement, we saw that. We saw that from the language that came, as well as from the organizing spaces in the churches. And of course, that was especially true in the African American community. But across the board, abolitionism and civil rights organizing started also in white and Black communities in spaces where people were drawing from deep within faith traditions.
Yeah, it's so beautiful. Wow, you just got me firing in a bunch of different directions at once, hearing you connect these dots the way that you just did. That's really wonderful and potent. And it strikes me that one of the most significant challenges and opportunities we face in the West, particularly in the United States, is really recognizing the deep roots of the philosophical, the religious disconnection from the natural living world. And of course, there's a whole bunch of literature, scholarship on how that relates both to environmental degradation and incredible social injustice. And whether we're looking at the very challenging derisive critique of Nietzsche 140 or 50 years ago, or we're looking at more recently the beautiful book by Thomas Berry called what is it, the Fate of the Earth and the Christian Future, or something like that. There's
the dream of the earth and the great work.
There's this very big conversation that's been unfolding over generations, and it seems to me we're now living at a moment when how this conversation unfolds and in a sense resolves itself in the next few years is incredibly significant in determining what our near and midterm future is going to look like. And I'm curious, in your role as an educator, how deep do you go into that history? How far back do you go? What threads are you pulling through for your students to help awaken them to the reality that we're living in right now?
Oh, thank you. Well, I know of your interest in this, and I've heard you speak and interview others, and so I really appreciate your work on this, Aaron, and happy to be part of that conversation. Well, for one thing, let me just say that the Center for Earth Ethics really grew out of this conference that we had. I went to Union and got a master's kind of mid-career, and then I had a general public programming job there. And it's a seminary based in New York City. So the idea was that when the United Nations meets every year, perhaps we could have something at Union that deals with religion and spirituality, and how it's affected, how it relates to whatever the UN happens to be focused on. Because the UN, for good reasons, mostly doesn't directly engage religion, but religion drives so much in the world, both for good and ill. And so anyway, I was there in September 2014. The Secretary General at the time, Ban Ki-moon, called the Climate Summit. It happens now every year, but to engage civil society, because this climate crisis is so urgent, and yet governments haven't been able to, this was before the Paris Agreement, get it together to get that agreement. And the idea was to engage civil society, which includes business, it includes different sectors, but religion was one component. So we were able to have this conference at Union called Religions for the Earth. And I was an organizer of that. And after that, we founded the center. So I tell you that background because I wanted to be able to engage in interreligious dialogue in a good way. And it was very clear that indigenous traditions were important to that and had not always been included in conventional interfaith dialogue. So looking at the history, having some of those conversations, doing some of that reading, looking more closely at the history of colonization and its relationship to ecological destruction, caused me to understand the history of the doctrine of discovery in this country, and that comes out of the fact that in the mid 15th century, the European nations were wanting to explore and colonize and extract from particularly the Americas and Africa. And from the Vatican, there was this papal bull that a series of them that said to conquer, vanquish, and subdue all the flora and fauna, and said that the non-Christian people, meaning all the native people, were part of the flora and fauna. So we look at that as a root cause of this sense, first of all, connecting white supremacy to ecological destruction, and the theology behind it, because it was explicitly coming from a place of Christianity. So that's important. Then if you go deeper, back in time even, it's very interesting to look at how this happened in the first place, with the conversion of the Emperor Constantine, the Roman emperor, to Christianity in the early 4th century. So that became the marriage of Christianity, which, as we know, this wasn't the teachings of Jesus or the texts of the Bible, were not already linked to this kind of empire and colonization behaviors, but although you can have an interesting discussion about the theology there. But in any event, when Constantine converted, and there was this push to Christianize Europe, we can look at one source in particular that I think is really interesting. And many people know it already, but there was an essay in 1967 by a medieval historian named Lynn White, who wrote The Historic Roots of Our Ecological Crisis. And he said in that essay that the greatest psychic revolution in human history was the victory of Christianity over paganism in Europe. And so that takes it back even further in time than the doctrine of discovery, to show the theological roots of a kind of doctrine that said that what is sacred, you cannot see your landscape as sacred, your ceremonies, a kind of fear and of paganism. And you still see that in a lot of the conversations and the kind of culture war that people have developed around, environmentalism or concern for the climate, that somehow you're a tree hugger, that you're worshiping nature. And that is that deep fear of paganism that goes that far back. So we try to look at those histories in order to see where that's coming from, in order to look clearly at the role that the church has played, which of course is not all for ill. There's been a lot of really beautiful theology and work within Christianity and other religions. But in a classroom, so we give classes at Union. That's one thing that we're able to do, and it's wonderful to work with Union students. So we can do that. We can do that reading, and then we can also talk to people who are living in communities now. And that's really what's most important, is to hear from people. For example, when the conflict at Standing Rock happened, some years ago, and we could hear from Lakota people who wanted to voice what that was about from their perspective. So we try to combine lived experiences with those scholarly texts and look at the root causes and then create earth ethics from there.
It's absolutely beautiful. So beautiful. You have me reflecting on my own heritage. And one of the things I've noticed talking with different folks is that in many communities, when we're talking about indigenous peoples, when we're talking about colonialism, for a lot of us, that's this experience that's way over there with people we don't know, or folks we're not connected to. And being the admixture of different lineages that I am, which include some Mohawk Native American ancestry, some Slovenian ancestry, some German ancestry, some Celtic ancestry, as I have dug into that over the years, what I've noticed is that all those different peoples were subjugated and subdued at different points in time. And one of the things I like to quip about, although it's serious, for those of us who think the Roman Empire failed, we perhaps don't quite understand history because of exactly that moment that Constantine marked in the 300s. And I think there's a big invitation for all of us in this moment right now, as modern human beings communicating with these incredible global communication technologies, to really pause for a moment and to go inside and to get in touch with that form of violence that almost all of our ancestors have experienced in one way, shape, or form, and to own it, and to also recognize that while we have that side in our backgrounds and history that has been victim, we also often, very often, have that side that was the oppressor and the subjugator. And it seems to me that, Karenna, one of the real deep spiritual opportunities in this for us as individuals is to open our eyes and really take a good look at that aspect of our reality, and then to start asking the questions, well, how can I start to heal this? How can I start to live differently? How can I start to approach the way I'm thinking differently, right? I think it evokes a lot of different rich questions, and I'm curious, what do you see when you're working with students in classrooms? Are you seeing a lot of aha moments? Is it more of a slow steeping? What do you observe with people as they're awakening to this?
That's so interesting. Thank you for what you said, and I really agree with you. I think people in our culture, in our time, tend to go to polarity very quickly, and yet it is a metaphysical and spiritual truth that there is a wholeness and a oneness at the center of this life experience, if you are trying to separate yourself or trying to separate from others, there will be an intrusion of the truth and the reality that there isn't that separation, actually. And if you can, and the healing work and the power really is, Thich Nhat Hanh, the Buddhist teacher, said, we are here to awaken to the illusion of our separateness. And I think sometimes about the particular kind of thought forms that have become more common in the Judeo-Christian tradition. Some people don't like that term Judeo-Christian because they rightly point out that the Jewish tradition stands on its own. But by that I mean how through Christianity in this country it's been interpreted, drawing also from what we call the Old Testament. In any event, there's a concept of justice that is very very big, and justice is through the past years of interfaith dialogue, one of the interesting things that I have learned is that it's not as resonant a concept in East Asian or Indic traditions or in indigenous traditions. It doesn't mean there's no such thing as right and wrong, or what justice implies, but as the way that it's used, that we're used to using it, it's not as resonant. There are things like balance and harmony. There are other, beautiful words that are used that have a different connotation than justice. So what I wanted to say is that there are times in classrooms where people, I think, really gravitate towards a kind of, there are bad guys, and if we isolate them and condemn them, everything will be fine. It's a thought form that many of us have, and even in your personal life, in your family, in your community, it's just a human nature thing. And so I think that what we've done is too easily fallen into that on a society level. It's just much more powerful and healing, I think, when we interrogate that a little bit more. So when Martin Luther King said famously, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere," that, I think, is quite similar to the Thich Nhat Hanh statement of, "We are here to awaken to the illusion of our separateness." So it's not only that it's unfair to these to certain groups of people if something happens disproportionately, it's that it will impact the whole. It will, just like, and the climate crisis is teaching us that. Those 3 empty chairs that I mentioned in the beginning, you don't pay attention to them, it's going to threaten the whole. And it's true in different layers, different levels. So I think that, in answer to your original question, in classrooms, it's very interesting. People are coming from really different places, but there is a kind of pattern of sort of holding these things together. Yes, there are these major issues of oppression that must be dealt with and faced. And like James Baldwin said, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed unless it is faced. Mm-hmm. So we have to face them. At the same time, we have to be able to hold that wholeness and understand that to kind of place blame and cast aside whole cultures or groups of people in history is not going to be the ultimate truth. The problem with it is that it's not the ultimate truth. So these are theological questions and metaphysical questions. Going back to there are always other dimensions of this to explore, going back to the history in Europe of empire and its effect on our ecological mindset today, to go back to, the Middle Ages in Europe, and even before then. It's interesting also to note that there were many women who were keepers of ceremonies and traditions and spirituality. So part of this also was to displace the feminine and to take the feminine out of the sense of who is a keeper of ceremony and sacred works. And of course, we still live with that today. And it's, I think, important for us to think about the impact that theology has had. Even people who consider themselves secular have nonetheless often internalized the idea that we have a male God and a female earth, just by virtue of absorbing literature and culture. It's just so deep in there. So what are the implications of that? And how do we look clearly at it in order to change it? So it's wonderful to be able to explore those things.
Yeah, so potent and so important. And I'm struck. I have so many friends who are women, who are herbalists and midwives and doulas and farmers, and working with ways they can keep people healthy and help people when they're sick. And the reality is, during the Middle Ages, a lot of those women were tortured and killed by millions. And not everyone knows that. Not everyone understands that part of our history. And I think it's so important that we dig into that and look eyes open at that aspect as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, you can see that there are many women, and particularly younger women, but the elders are important too, finding voice in this time of understanding the concept of planetary health, and our connections to water and air and land. And so it's very exciting, and there's so much pain. There's actually real trauma to be worked through, on a community psyche level or a societal psyche level. And I think that's sometimes what you see in the discourse. So it's, I think, important also that we're really forgiving and compassionate with somebody who has, kind of gets connected to that anger and pain because it's present. And also people who make mistakes, who don't see that it's there and say something wrong. We live in that, and that, of course, in the academy, that's famously territory for where that goes on. So, but it's true everywhere. So I think that it's very important that we take care of that, take care of our, forgiveness capacity and sensitivity capacity at the same time.
Mm-hmm. That's tremendous. I really think and sense that we could probably have a whole separate discussion around the healing of trauma and how that's showing up in communities right now. And I find myself in a whole bunch of different conversations, many of which are one-on-one around this issue. And while each of our personal experiences is very particular and specific, there also seems to be in the collective an increasing awareness that trauma and healing trauma is bubbling to the surface and becoming more and more in our face, I guess we could say, for lack of a better term.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with that, and there's a fair amount of discovery right now that that nature is healing in this regard, and that's one of the things that we like to study and talk about at the Center for Earth Ethics is how our economic measurements are so off, like how we measure a successful society by a metric like GDP, which doesn't count pollution, depletion of resources, inequality, or positive investments like protecting a whole forest. That gets you nowhere with economic growth measured by GDP, but of course we know the long-term benefit for the community. And so looking at what is devoured by this system, this short-term monetary gain system, no matter how inequitable, no matter the depletion, no matter the pollution, that's the engine that we're running on right now. And what's getting eaten up with that is these spaces like forests, wetlands, spaces where people can go, and more, more and more people should be able to go. There are issues of equity with access to that too, which we have to discuss. But more people are realizing that actually it's good for your health, and there are studies that show that that actually heart disease, as well as anxiety and depression, of course, are reduced if people are able to spend time immersed in these natural environments. And the only reason, why it's not more prevalent and protected is that it's not making money. And so we've confused money with virtue in our society so much that we're allowing all of this of greatest value to be destroyed. So I'm not saying anything new. Many people have said this. I'm just coming to it in a place where I'd like to put it into an earth ethics construct that we might be able to create some educational workshops and curriculum around, so that we can start to really walk the change. So thank you for mentioning it.
Yeah, absolutely, Karenna. And I think part of this too is the opportunities we have to bring more of the wild and the natural into our urban and suburban landscapes. And I really see it as a both and. And I'm so thrilled, of course, to hear you're working on this. And there's so much exciting science emerging right now showing that literally trees are giving off particular pheromones that are affecting our cognitive performance, that are affecting our neurobiochemistry, affecting our immunity. We know interacting physically with living soil has all kinds of really positive effects on us as individual humans. So it's near and dear to my heart, and I'm really curious. I want to ask you. Here we are, coronavirus. We're in varying forms of lockdown right now, and you're up in the Catskills with your kids, and I'm curious, what's it like for you to probably have a bit more time with your kids, or at least some different time with your kids, and to be in a more natural setting than being right there in the middle of Manhattan. How are you noticing the impacts from these changes?
Well, thank you for asking. I have to say up front that I do feel I I feel a bit guilty, I guess is the word, kind of dwelling on these silver linings, because I'm so aware of the people that don't have space to escape or to go to. Um, and so I just want to preface by saying that there are ways to help, like particularly people in situations that involve domestic violence, who are living in poverty. There's so many children, who rely on the public schools for food, and are now in a situation at home. So just to say that I think that those of us who are able to be someplace else other than a city where we normally live can give back and meet that what really is a responsibility, to help provide to those people through organizations that you trust. In each city, I know you have a bigger viewership than just New York City, so I won't name mine, but I do think that's really important to keep in mind. But to your question, it's being able to see the stars at night, pay attention to the moon cycle, how it appears here in the sky, and walk outside to get fresh air. Fresh air is really medicinal. And I was even reading that they've known that for some. They, have known that, we've all known that, humans have for a long time, going back to different pandemics and epidemics and plagues and the Spanish flu and all of that actually fresh air walks is medicinal for your lungs, and particularly if you're out in a place where there are a lot of trees. So I'm enjoying being able to have that kind of access, whereas normally I'm on the 9th floor of an apartment building. I'm very fortunate, love my home, but super noisy, super urban, and it is definitely a different type of experience being here for going on now into the second month of this quarantine time, or shelter in place time. Okay, so another thing is just having time with kids, and being able to just take those moments where, normally people are coming and going, and you actually are just sitting with each other, with the time to actually talk. No one is going off to see friends or whatever else. And that has been wonderful, just to really embrace that time with whoever you're with. And of course, if you're not physically with them, you can do that on FaceTime. I think people are thinking about who are the elders in my life, who maybe feel especially vulnerable right now, and can I call them and check on them? So it's also on the phone. But for example, we like to have fires here, and I was realizing that my 13-year-old son should gather firewood in the woods. We need more of it. We haven't gotten a delivery of it. He needs to go do it himself, and to make that, it's kind of feels like back to the original instructions, as some indigenous people have taught, to go back to the original instructions, which is basically, what's our food, shelter situation? How do we work together in a family unit to provide for it, to share the meals and the cleaning, housekeeping work, and the container of your home? When you think about shelter in place, it's also, where are we? And to be really rooted, and to look around, take a good look at where you are and what your life is like, is a gift. And again, well aware that there are people suffering through this, and don't want to, but again, we can, a lot of this in our discourse now, we have to be more comfortable with paradox or with holding two things together at the same time. And so that's what I'm trying to do with this coronavirus. And it's been interesting.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah, thanks, Karenna. And I'm reflecting on your three children. The two older of your three children are roughly the same ages as my daughter and son. And it's such an interesting chapter of life. And what a joy. My kids are not in the same vicinity as I am. So for us, it's phone conversations and interacting a bit more in that way. And clearly a lot of us are not quite as busy or frenetic in our day-to-day lives at the moment. So there's more spaciousness for that kind of communication, it seems. And what a joy. And I'm also sitting here thinking, I'm trying to do some quick math in my head to ask you this question, because I have to ask. I'm sure some of our audience would give me a hard time if I didn't ask. But okay, so when your dad, Al Gore, was vice president, you were roughly in the age range as our kids currently. Am I doing that math right? Or
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
okay.
It happened. Yeah.
Okay, so what was that like as an adolescent, young adult? Your dad is the vice president of one of the most powerful nations on the planet. There's a lot going on, I imagine. Can you give us just a glimpse into that experience in a way I imagine most of us in the audience might hope to glimpse only through a movie or something like that?
Well, thank you for the question. Sure, I'm happy to. So I will say first that my father was elected to Congress when I was 3. So in 1976, he went to Congress. And so he was in Congress, in the House of Representatives for 8 years, representing Tennessee, and then 8 years in the Senate representing Tennessee. And I grew up between a farm in Middle Tennessee and the suburbs of Washington, D.C. because of that. He ran for president himself for the first time when I was 14. So that was from that time understood to be his goal and his calling, I should say. And so by the time there was already that sense of what being in the public eye was about in terms of that public service and those issues that he particularly cared about, and the role of government in life and how it can be a force for good if done correctly and all of that. And so when it was in 1992 that he joined the ticket, and I had just ended my freshman year of college at that point. So you're right, I hadn't thought about it before. Thank you, that it's the same age actually as my older 2 kids, pretty much, when this all happened. And so he then, of course, did become more well-known, and there's a kind of a bubble that happens in that life because of security, because of the intense kind of media scrutiny, which is often not really based. It's like there's a gap between reality and kind of image or illusion. There's a real gap that you have to live in there, like in terms of personas and what the story is, and all that kind of stuff. And it's a strange place to be. And I was already in college. My parents were not the kind of people that said, like, oh, you have to dress this way and talk this way and behave this way, or like, they weren't like that. They're like from the 60s generation. They were really like, do your own thing. So I didn't face that kind of internal pressure from the family, and I did largely sort of live my life. I didn't want to have Secret Service protection, and I was given the option not to because I didn't want it. And so I didn't, I stayed out of the kind of middle of it as much as I could in those early years, but of course lived it vicariously, and it affected our family in a big way. So it was interesting in many ways. It's a huge honor to be able to participate in sort of civic activities in the front row, whatever they might be, an inauguration of the president in which assembled there, you have Supreme Court justices and members of the House and the Senate, and to feel that the pulse of that civic life from a kind of perch there. There were enormous privileges for which I am grateful for. But also I would say there's a fair amount of imbalance in terms of your connection to what really matters in life that you have to navigate. Really, and some of the illusion falls away. Like anybody that's been through this in life, but people go through it in small scale ways too. I know, like if your father was the principal of the school that you go to or whatever, where there people are maybe not your real friend. They're actually your friend because of that. All that kind of stuff goes on, and you just navigate it. I'm happy that I learned through it. The 2000 election was quite difficult, as it was for the whole country, and then since then have sort of followed a winding, hilly path to where I am now at the Center for Earth Ethics.
Yeah, well, cool. Well, thanks for sharing that with us, Karenna. And listen, I want to get to a couple of other topics that I know we need to hit on in order to share with our audience, including this really exciting poetry project that you guys are working on. But let me first pause quickly to thank some of our sponsors and to remind our audience, this is the Why on Earth Community Podcast. I'm your host, Aaron Perry, and we're visiting today with Karenna Gore from the Center for Earth Ethics. And a huge shout out to our supporters, which include a whole bunch of folks who have joined our monthly giving program at a variety of levels. And I think we in fact have friends contributing at $1 per month, and everything helps. If you haven't yet joined the monthly giving program and you'd like to, you can go to whyonearth.org/support. A huge shout out also to the Lidge Family Foundation, Patagonia, Purium, Earth Coast Productions, Earth Water Press, and Waylay Waters. And some of you are familiar that we've got these really exciting partnerships with a few of those companies. And so, for example, you can go to the Purium link at the Why on Earth website, and if you purchase any of Purium's organic supplements and plant-based products, some of that revenue comes back to the Why on Earth community to support our community mobilization work. Earth Water Press is our new social enterprise helping folks publish their books. Check that out, earthwaterpress.com. And then Waylay Waters is our CBD aromatherapy soaking salts. Now, in this time of staying at home, you too can have a spa at home experience with Waylay Waters, and it's a great way to keep your immune system strong, relax a bit, get a better night's sleep. You can learn more about the Waylay Waters monthly program at whyonearth.org/Waylay, WELE-Waters with an S. So a huge thanks to everybody for making all of this possible. And Karenna, we're all, I can tell, doing some different things as a result of COVID-19, and some folks are sharing more live music recordings through social media, and others of us are playing more with things like poetry. And you guys are doing some really cool things with poetry as well. And I would love to hear about this and share with our audience what you're up to and how they can get engaged and get involved.
Oh, thank you so much for mentioning. We are, the Center for Earth Ethics has partnered with the Wick Poetry Center at Kent State, and they have a really wonderful platform called Traveling Stanzas. And what it is it presents poems and then gives a person the opportunity to interact with the poem. So we curated a selection of 6 poems that we thought were particularly good for this 50th Earth Day. and you can then take a prompt from one of them, which often is the first line, maybe it's a different line, and write your own poem, and then post it and share it. And there's a second portal on this this site, which is called Emerge, and we've curated 10 documents, some texts that we thought would be very interesting to read in this time. An example, we have an excerpt from the IPCC climate report. We have the Haudenosaunee Address to the Western World from 1977. We have the Gettysburg Address. We have writings from Howard Thurman and Terry Tempest Williams. And so it's really interesting to look at these texts that we've curated, and then that you do an erasure poem. So you're able to select, and in this very cool, colorful, fun, interactive platform, select certain words, highlight certain words, and then everything else falls away and you're left with those words to create your poem from. So we're really excited about it. It's a way just to get us thinking and connecting and finding our voices, and it's on earthstanzas.com.
Great, and that stanzas with a Z in there, right? We'll make sure that link is in the show notes. And
Thank you.
You've shared some other links. You've got the poems.travelingstanzas.com, which is the project out at Kent State, right? And then there's
within the same thing.
Okay, cool. And then there's globalpeacepoem.com.
It's within the same project, so I don't want it to sound too complicated, but if you click on any of those, you can go to the other ones and just play around with it.
Okay, fabulous. While we're at it, I'll make sure to mention too that folks can learn more about Center for Earth Ethics at centerforearthethics.org. And you guys are also on Facebook, Earth Ethics CTR, and Twitter, also Earth Ethics CTR. So we'll put that in the show notes as well. And you know, I'm reflecting back to the earlier part of our conversation and really deepening into this sense of some of the origins of conflict and the challenges that we're facing. And there's been some intense tensions. And then on the other hand, right now there's this thing called eco-ministry, which from my perspective is really helping to resolve and to heal across a lot of these different arenas and disciplines. And I'm wondering if you might share with folks what is eco-ministry and how does that play a role in your life?
Well, eco-ministry, we didn't invent this term. It's sort of been bubbling up as people have been thinking about the intersection of the environment and religion. It has a couple different aspects of it. So for one thing, ministry is in the conventional sense of a faith leader, a reverend, a pastor, a rabbi, an imam, but it's also broader than that. People have a kind of ministry if they're doing working in a substance abuse recovery clinic, if they're working on a community garden and trying to draw people in to practice growing their own food. There's a type of ministry that is not necessarily tied to the conventional faith traditions. So that we take that broader view, but we also are interested in the organizing power and reach of conventional faith communities. So we do both. And we have an annual ministers training, Ministry in the Time of Climate Crisis, where we have brought a cohort of about, it's been 30, 40 mid-career faith leaders, but again, with that wider lens as to who we're talking about, and come together and learn the science and the policy aspects of climate change, and then also reflect together on sacred texts and teachings, ritual and ceremony, and also topics like ecological grief. So there are different roles that ministry can play. There's the prophetic and the pastoral. Prophetic is truth-telling, which is so important right now. It's like what we were talking about earlier, seeing the value in these things like forests that are devalued by our economic system, telling the truth about what we're missing with the way that our economies and our politics are devised right now. And then pastoral, really helping people as individuals, families, and communities to grapple with loss and grief and trauma. And of course, some of that is tied to the ecological crisis that we're in right now, whether it's from a sense of impending climate impacts for our children, or whether it's from an actual present environmental assault because you live in a toxic neighborhood and you're not able to stop yet another toxic factory going in there. That these are all dimensions of the ecological situation that we're in right now. So eco-ministry is a way to be together with people who are wanting that to be part of their lives, their vocational and personal paths. And we often do, of course, learn as much from them about what's going on as we're able to impart. So it's an important part of the center.
That is so beautiful. I get really, really excited about this sort of thing. And I've spent a lot of time around different ministers and ministries. And I am so thrilled to have met Reverend Brian Kunkler from Akron, Ohio. And we did a podcast with him a while back, and we actually toured his permaculture food forest project. And he's working with low-income immigrant minority communities in the Akron area to help install food forests in these vacant and often dilapidated properties that the city owns. And it's such a beautiful expression of this kind of eco ministry. I don't know how your nominating process works, but I would certainly throw Brian's name in that hat.
Yeah.
His theology
I'd love to be there.
Is amazing. Also, I went to one of his services, and he's evangelical, and he started bringing it and preaching it, and I was smiling ear to ear because it was such a beautiful expression of the love at the core of the Christian message as it relates to being in service in these times and eyes open. So it thrills me that you and Center for Earth Ethics are helping to really cultivate this. And I imagine there's a whole lot of cross-pollinating that occurs when you bring these different community leaders together.
Absolutely. And thank you for the way that you are putting spotlight on those voices. And everybody should watch your podcast with Ryan. It's available on your site, right?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I don't remember which episode off the top of my head, but you can find it there.
Okay.
Let me ask one last kind of question here before we sign off for the day. The United Nations has Sustainable Development Goals, 17 of them. And, I give talks and workshops throughout the country, often in the breadbasket, Middle America, Kansas, Ohio, what have you. And it's amazing to me, having spent some time around some of the United Nations gatherings, including with the big climate march last fall, that we have folks in our society who are doing a lot of really wonderful work through and with and in collaboration with United Nations and folks affiliated with it as part of a global community. On the other hand, we've got a lot of folks who don't have that direct experience and have incredible mistrust toward the United Nations. And one of the things we've been doing with the Y on Earth community is sharing a bit more openly about the various Sustainable Development Goals, why they matter, why they're important. And my very favorite is number 17, actually, the collaboration, the ways we get to work together. Yes. But can you share with us how you're weaving that piece and dimension into your educational and eco ministry work? And are you encountering some of these disparate reactions and responses as well?
Yeah, that's a really interesting topic. And it's, so 17 goals is a lot of goals. It's a really wonderful effort to shift the development paradigm. So it's interesting, when the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was signed in 1948, and the United Nations was new, the population was, I think, 2.8 billion, and now it's, I think, 7.8 or so and growing. At the same time, there's been a kind of turbocharge of global corporations, industrial processes, the oil and gas industry especially, kind of in their activities. And so we've seen that there's been this realization that the goal, as it used to be, to end poverty by just doing economic growth, was actually destroying the ecosystem that we all depend on. So if you're going to end poverty by building a ton of coal mines and lots of factories so people have more dollars a day, it's not going to do anybody very much good if all of a sudden the rivers are polluted and the soil is depleted and people end up having to be refugees because their region is uninhabitable because of climate change. So that's the central realization, that the development paradigm has to change to be based on more than just short-term economic growth. And the SDGs really reflect, a great depth of understanding and breadth of ambition in terms of gender equality, life under the ocean, life above the ocean, water and sanitation. And so, it's an interesting group of goals. Number 13 is climate action. So the critique of them is that even within this structure, there is still a use of GDP, economic growth, or still a use of some metrics to measure it that don't really take into account necessarily protecting these things, like local cultures and forests and soil. I've heard Ratan Lal of Ohio State, great soil scientist, says that the soils aren't mentioned enough, and that maybe we need to have a Clean Soil Act in this country. And I know you've done so much work with soil, so I'm bringing that up in particular. So there are a few blind spots, I would say, but it's all a very important, the other thing would be that, you can meet some of these goals, like, if you want to say, we know we have to stop digging and burning fossil fuels, okay? We have to end that fossil fuel era, or else the whole thing isn't going to matter, because we won't have a habitable Earth within whatever time frame. And so there are some goals, like, even if you had gender equality by having all women in charge of fossil fuel companies, if you said you're ending poverty, and one of the goals is actually economic growth. So you could say you're meeting, like, several of these goals, and yet be doing something that undermines number 13, which is the climate one. And so that's just to give the sense of where some of the critique is coming from, I think, that you're referencing. And some people, like traditional indigenous peoples, will say, the goals say, leave no one behind. And they're like, behind? Where are we at? Where do we all have to go? We're trying to go back to original instructions. We don't want to go, like, what do you mean? Take everybody where? Why would we necessarily want to go there? So there's an interesting critique. But, we have to also just step back and realize this is all we've got. The United Nations is what we have to work with. It's by definition about nation states, and it's by definition working in the world we live in now. So we have to deal with that. But within it, there are pathways to transformation, and having this discussion around the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, if we all engage them a bit more and make them both intelligible and accountable to people really living in frontline communities, it can be a wonderful tool for change.
Yeah, beautiful, beautiful. Well, thank you for reviewing that with us and for us. And so, Karenna, I'm so thrilled we were able to connect and have this conversation today. And before signing off, I just want to ask you, is there anything else that we didn't get to, or that you want to be sure to share with our audience before we say goodbye for now?
Oh, just that I really appreciate Why on Earth. I appreciate the work you do, Erin. I really, it was wonderful to have you visit Union Theological Seminary and to see the presentation you did about soil. And I'm just delighted to be connected. And I hope folks will tune into your other podcasts and that we can find a way to work together again in the future too.
Yeah, I very much look forward to that also, Karenna. And oh my goodness, it's wonderful talking with you. And I hope you have a fabulous rest of the day and take good care with all that's going on. And thanks for all your work and all you're doing for our world right now.
Thank you very much, Erin. Take care and happy Earth Day. And hope to see you again soon.
Yeah, sounds great, Karenna. Happy Earth Day.
The Why on Earth Community Stewardship and Sustainability podcast series is hosted by Aaron William Perry, author, thought leader, and executive consultant. The podcast and video recordings are made possible by the generous support of people like you. To sign up as a daily, weekly, or monthly supporter, please visit whyonearth.org/support. Support packages start at just $1 per month. The podcast series is also sponsored by several corporate and organization sponsors. You can get discounts on their products and services using the code WHYONEARTH, all one word with a Y. These sponsors are listed on the whyonearth.org/support page. If you found this particular podcast episode especially insightful, informative, or inspiring, please pass it on and share it with a friend whom you think will also enjoy it. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for your support. And thank you for being a part of the Why on Earth community.